Hello, everyone. It is Monday, which means it's Zen Money Monday, and we are talking live with my friend Michael Roderick, and we're going to dive into not only the cool business that he has built over the last several years or more, but also the concepts of relationship building and what it means to build a referable brand. So we really want to dig into how to maximize all of these potential networking connections and all of that good stuff. But also, I just really want to ask you a bunch of questions about your business because I think it's really, your story is really interesting to me anyway, and hopefully to our listeners. So welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Michael and I met through a mutual friend who's building another amazing business in New York City. And so we often have conversations about what's happening in the hot city versus the not hot New Hampshire mountains. But right now, we both feel fall coming on, which feels like kind of a transition, which is where I wanted to start with, because you have a very interesting background in that you don't come from a business background originally.
Yeah, not at all. I started out as a high school English teacher, was sort of the beginning of my world. And I went from being a high school English teacher to a Broadway producer in under 2 years. So I sort of, ended up in this completely different industry kind of world. And a lot of that work led to people asking me how I had moved so quickly, and I realized that there was something to actually teaching this material, and that's what kind of shot me, if you will, into this world of entrepreneurship and all of the things that I'm doing these days.
Awesome. I want to touch on all of that, but first, I find it fascinating. This, as we all know, I love teachers. I love the education world, being married to a teacher as well. So I'm always just intrigued by people who move from that world into doing something else. And obviously, as an English teacher and then as a Broadway producer, presumably arts has always been of interest to you. How did you make that transition? What was the process there?
So basically, I had always really been interested in theater. I had always loved theater. I'd always wanted to be a part of the world of theater. And I'm one of those people, I like to kind of figure out how things work. So I've always just been very, very curious. Like if I see something, I'll be like, yeah, that's cool. But like, how did they do it? Like, what was that process? And one of the things that I had learned was that Broadway producing was basically about raising money. And it was all about like how much money can you raise to from investors to get a show off the ground. And when I started to look at the actual mechanics of all that, I found that there was something really, really interesting, which was that for most people on the producing side, credit was the most important thing. So having their names above the title on something or having their name attached to a particular project was a really, really big thing. So a lot of producers were going to other producers and negotiating for credit. And what I realized was that if I didn't negotiate for credit, if I just went to producers and said, I just want to get better at raising money, then I would get a completely different base of deal flow. And that's really what happened. I just went to other producers that I respected and I said, listen, I don't know if I'm going to be able to raise the kind of money that some of these other folks are raising, but I want to try. And I don't need my name on anything right now because I'm just learning. And so many of these people just kind of gave me paperwork and said, yeah, knock yourself out, try to do it. And I learned so much from that particular process. And as a result, I started having producers come and offer me credit as opposed to going out and sort of seeking it. So I would say that's kind of one of the biggest aspects of that transition was this sort of breakdown of what do these people care the most about and how do I become someone who helps them get their name out there and do their thing, as opposed to just trying to figure out how do I become a Broadway producer.
How was it? Was it difficult to transition into asking people for money? This is the Zen Money Monday show, after all.
Yeah, I mean, So it was a crazy scenario. I mean, when I was working in sort of the smaller not-for-profit theater world, you're asking people to donate $5 to you. You're asking people to maybe give you $20 for a theater ticket. Like you're not asking for large sums of money. And in the early stages, it was very, very difficult because I was first nervous about it, really, really concerned. But I was working at the time, I was interning with a Broadway producer who was pretty successful. And he introduced me to Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. And the book is all about sort of all the different reasons why we say yes to things. The entire reason the book was written was Cialdini was constantly being the one to like buy the candy bars from the kids and take the magazine subscriptions. He was like, why do I do this? So he breaks it down. And when I read this book, I started to realize it was kind of like the Matrix, where you're just like, oh, this is why people make these decisions. So I started just incorporating that into my conversations, and I started making it not about, give me money for this show, or I need money for this show. I started making it about, this show needs to happen because, and you're part of the story of making this show happen. So more people were interested in giving money to a project like that. And then the other thing I discovered that was fascinating was that if I asked directly, if I said, hey, do you want to donate, do you want to invest in this project? I would often get people who would basically say no, or people who would be like, very dismissive. But if I went to somebody who had invested and I said, listen, I'm new to this, I don't really know too much about it, you've invested in these projects before, I'm curious, what do you actually think of this offer? Do you think it's a viable offer? Do you think it's something that's worth investing in? And a lot of the time, what would happen would be I would get really good advice about the project, or those people would just be willing to invest. And what I discovered about that, and that ended up starting to become some of my teaching on the relationship building side, is that when we ask indirectly, it triggers this different part of the brain. So we're not in fight or flight mode anymore. We're in creativity mode. We're trying to solve a problem. And I often say that you limit the things you get in life when you limit other people's creativity. When you don't allow them to think creatively about how to solve the problem, then it's just a yes or no. So when I started doing this indirect asking, and I started just saying, like, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, do you have any ideas? I'd get introductions to investors. I'd get people who were willing to invest. I'd get people who wanted to introduce me to other producers, all because I shifted from this direct approach to indirect. And I've found it's been incredibly useful in all sorts of other areas as well.
I really appreciate that you brought that up because, I talk to people, I get to be in the back end of various businesses, and, we are all so, if we just want to look at that concept from a money standpoint, we are so turned off about the transactional piece of money. I mean, that's what money is, right? It's a tool, goes from point A to point B, and we make decisions about it, and it is either a positive or negative in our lives. And oftentimes we feel like it's a negative, but I think because it's in this very linear, give and take, you give, I take version, that doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel collaborative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Money, and this, money just makes people act weird. You'll have people, they'll be very, very, like, you'll have a great conversation with them. You'll really get along well with them. And then all of a sudden, if money comes into play, there's often a big shift in sort of how it's operating. And I see it a lot in the world of entrepreneurship, where when somebody goes from, hey, I'm getting to know you, to I'm selling, you're just kind of like, what just happened? Like where, why are you acting this way? But I do think it has this, like, it goes back to that sort of primitive direct, you have that sort of fight or flight moment. And I think that for a lot of people, if you are in a place where you're like, I need to sell this now, or I need to make this thing happen now, I like to refer to it as asking blinders. When we have a very, very high level of need for something, we stop paying attention to the other person. We stop paying attention to all the signals and all the things that we would normally get in just a basic social scenario, because we're so focused on that thing that we want. And I think money, especially when people are trying to sell, that's a bit, that's a really, really big thing, especially the higher the level of need.
Higher level of the need, higher level of the monetary ask. All of it gets very, very tangled for many of us. So I think this conversation is really, really pertinent, because if we're talking about business building and how to do it successfully, relationships really are the key. And I'm curious, based on this whole learning how to, basically ask for money part of your Broadway producing career.
Yeah.
Did you get to a point where the dollar amount didn't matter because you'd sort of figured out how to massage a conversation, or was that always tricky?
It wasn't always tricky, but I definitely did get to a place where we were having more conversations about the show and the individual and what mattered to them, that when we got to the money, it was not as much of a conversation. And a lot of the time, especially with Broadway investing, you have to work with accredited investors. So basically, before you even have a meeting, you have to make an understanding. You have to have an understanding, is this person in a position to actually invest? And the other thing that I found worked really well for me was opening the conversation with the fact that this was high risk. So I never tried to sell and then sort of get to the end and be like, oh, and you might lose your money. I always started it with, we probably shouldn't continue this conversation unless this is money you're willing to gamble. Unless you're the type of person who likes to roll the dice, because this is a very, very high risk, high reward kind of world. There are only certain shows that end up making their money back, and there are very, very few shows that make more than their money back. Most shows don't make everything back. Most shows make maybe half if they're lucky, and there are plenty of shows that open and just close. So I would tell people when I started, this is the scenario, and unless this is money you're willing to lose, we shouldn't continue this conversation. I'm sure there are plenty of other producers who will tell you that it's perfectly fine and, take a risk and all these other things, but that's not me. And I found that when I did that, there was just a higher level of trust, and people were more open to sharing with me their ideas and sharing with me their suggestions of other investors and people who would work, with projects or other producers, because they knew that I was interested in making sure that they were informed throughout the process. And I honestly think, just from a business standpoint, that's something that we always have to sit down and ask ourselves, are we doing? Are we being completely honest about both the risks and the rewards of whatever it is that we do? And if you talk about even something like messaging, I'm never going to be the entrepreneur who tells you, if I change this for you, you're going to make, $500,000. Because there are so many variables to what kind of success you're going to have based off of the work that we do together, that I can't in good conscience say, oh, I'm going to solve this problem for you. I'm going to say, these are the results that I've had before. These are the things that have worked before. I'm going to work with you on developing something of this, of this same nature. But the market is going to make its own decision. I'm not the market.
Right. I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which way to lead this. Okay, before we leave the Broadway conversation, because I'm really intrigued by this back end, like how it works.
Yeah.
Because basically, you have people who, are they looking at it as just a cultural donation? If very few shows actually even break even, then clearly it's just I'm contributing to the arts, presumably.
To a degree. So as I had mentioned before, everybody has different motivations for this, right? So for some people, the motivation is in essence being able to live vicariously through the production. So if
Mm-hmm.
you, let's say, went into corporate and you have a very, very cushy job and you make a lot of money, but you feel like there isn't much excitement in your life, being able to say, I invested in this show and take your friends to go to this opening night and, be a part of that experience is more valuable than anything else. For
Mm-hmm.
some people, it's about what was the show. So I raised money for a show called the Scottsboro Boys, which was a very intense, sort of racially charged production. And for people who were really interested in that subject matter and wanted this message to be out there, it wasn't about the money, it was about the fact that the message was out there. And for others, there are celebrities who end up in Broadway shows. So if you invest in that show, you're hanging out at an opening night party with that celebrity. And for some people, being close to that celebrity is the value proposition. Or being able to say, I invested in this celebrity show is the value proposition. So there's all these different reasons why people do it that have nothing to do with whether or not there's going to be a monetary result. And it's very similar if you look at a lot of the sort of coaching consulting worlds, right? There are a lot of people who they don't spend the money because they're like, oh, I'm going to make more money. They spend the money because there's something completely outside of the money. They spend the money because emotionally working with this particular coach makes it so that they're able to, be clear and solve their problems. So in some cases, it's literally they pay the money because they know themselves and they're like, I know I won't be accountable, so I'm going to pay somebody to hold me accountable. We each have our own desires and reasons that have nothing to do a lot of the time with return on investment.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's exactly where I was going to go with it. I mean, it's, sometimes we pay just to be in the circle or be able to have access to a room.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because from my perspective, if we're talking business strategy and actual financial ROI, people throw these words around and it drives me bonkers because it's, I'm investing in this coach or I'm investing in this programmer. And, from a very strict financial standpoint, those aren't investments, they're expenses to your business. And we can quote unquote, invest. And really all we're doing is having a really expensive hobby to be able to be in these rooms. So I think it's really important for all of us, you and I and our listeners and whoever is here, to think about how you're making those spending decisions, because you don't need to necessarily say, all right, I spent $5,000 to put myself in this room. Did I meet enough potential clients to generate enough profit to make that worthwhile spend, right? That's basically how the math works. Most of the time we're just like, well, that was great. I feel really rejuvenated. I didn't really get anything out of it, but it's okay. And we move on and we do it again. But I think it's an important talking point around there are different versions of value. Yeah. But don't deceive yourself either, because you may not actually get anything back monetarily, and it may not actually push your business forward, but that doesn't mean that there isn't value there. But if we can be conscious of that, cognizant of what that dynamic might be, I think it helps us make better strategic decisions for our business.
Yeah, and I also think what you're getting at too is the fact that language is used all the time to influence our decisions. So from a marketing standpoint, when somebody talks about the idea of investing in yourself, you have a completely different level of emotional resonance than somebody saying, spend money on this.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a different dynamic that you're experiencing because of the language and because of the marketing. And you have to sit back and ask yourself, okay, well, what is the language and the marketing and what is the reality of what this actually is? And the other thing that I think is really interesting about what you just brought up is the fact that so much of what is taught and what's structured is around the idea of planning and execution. But how much do we have about reflection? Like, you look at all the books that will tell us how to plan, that'll tell us how to do things faster, etc. But when it comes to reflection, we've got journals. Right.
which you like, and for many people, we come from, we're in a very sort of specific online entrepreneurial space to a certain extent, even more traditionally, people are just like, journaling, what the hell is that? Right.
Exactly.
You're like, well, I'm an English teacher, I'm a writer. Like, sometimes there's a vast portion of the population who doesn't even, kind of consider that perspective. It's just, you go to bed at night and you wake up in the morning, it's a whole new day and you're off and running. Yeah, reflection is huge. And I really appreciate that you brought that up, because especially on the topic of going to get additional education to further yourself or your business, we'll stick with business because that's what we're talking about, but whatever it might be, a lot of times it is around how do you do it sexier, better, so that you can make more money. But there's two issues with that. One, they very rarely actually get into sort of the nitty gritty details around what actually makes for a thriving business. Is all this language that sounds fantastic and it gets us all revved up and excited. But there isn't really a bridge to the reality for many of us. But at the same time, there's this whole piece of the puzzle around how do we make this fiscally, financially, meaningful, other than just to be like, yay, I was in a cool room with cool people and now I'm $5,000 in the hole and I got to kind of start all over again.
Yeah. And it's also just that piece of, sitting down afterwards and saying, okay, maybe I didn't meet clients at this particular event. And this actually ties really well into relationship building, because a lot of the time when people think about relationship building, they're kind of on like, can I get client mode? Like,
right.
And that's where a lot of like the bad networking advice starts to, rear its ugly head. It's about, okay, I did this, maybe I met one or two people who could fit within the client profile, but how many people did I meet that have expertise that I do not have, that basically can help me really just kind of shift and change the way that I'm doing things so that I have more time to reach out to potential clients, so that I even understand how to reach out to potential clients and prospects and not alienate them and not tick them off and all these different types of things. Because we've all been to events where afterwards people follow up with us and we literally get on the phone with them and it's just a sales pitch.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is such a wasted opportunity. Such a wasted opportunity, because there's so many other things we can do for people than give them our money. But so many people look at us, in the context of like, well, you're a cash register after this, after a particular experience. And it ties back to Broadway, because people, when I would sit on panels, the biggest question I'd always get asked on a panel was, how do I find investors? And my answer was always the same. You stop calling them investors. Yeah. These are people, and they have varying reasons for doing the things that they do. And they're not just checkbooks. They're individuals with lives and experiences and things that they actually need and want. And you've got to get to know them as people.
And this is back to the languaging too, because I don't know if you've ever felt this way, but I often feel you can feel there's sort of a vibe around certain languaging and the way people use it. And sometimes it's very genuine, like call them partners, right? But that only works if you really feel that, right? Yeah. Otherwise, it just feels like marketing crap, right?
Yep.
Just trying to like brush under the fact that we're your cash cow, right? So you have to be very genuine in not only the language you choose and how you choose to present yourself and how you want to interact with people. What am I trying to say here? It has to be both, right? We can't just choose the language that sounds prettiest. We have to mean it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. I remember back when I was teaching, I would mentor student teachers. And I had one student teacher who had a heck of a time where the students were just really giving this guy a hard time. And after a while, I sort of went to my students and I said, can you just tell me, like, why are you giving this guy such a hard time? And they said, he's the bootleg version of you.
Huh.
And when I started to watch a little bit more, I realized, oh, he's just kind of copying the style, the way that I talk, the things that I do. And as a result, when you do that, when you sort of create that bootleg version of whoever, it isn't authentic. And then people are like, I'm not sure who you are. I'm not sure why I should trust you. Like, you have to sit and say, okay, does this language actually sit well with me? And if it doesn't, even if somebody told you that is the language to use, right? That is the way to say it, that you have to sit with yourself and say, is this language that like really legitimately fits in my mouth? Because if it doesn't, people are going to know. They're going to pick up right away if you're saying something and you don't believe in it, or you're saying something because you learned that this was the way to close.
Right. It feels so disingenuous. Yeah.
Exactly. It's about being who you are and communicating what it is that you need, communicating what it is that you can help with, and doing it in your own way, as opposed to, this is why I'm very bullish on the idea of frameworks over formulas. I really think that if you try to give somebody a 6-step process, or you say these words, you're just going to create bootleg versions of somebody else. Whereas if you give somebody a framework, you give them a way to think about something, they can take it and run with it and bring themselves to it. And I think that's the most important piece, is bringing ourselves to whatever process, whatever work we do, because that is where messaging really resonates. That's where people say, oh, you talk like me. So I don't feel alone in the way that you're describing this, or the way that you're doing this. And I think that's such a powerful thing.
Yes, to all of those things, because it's true across the board, right? We can make this parallel to how we even take it to the money conversation, whether it's selling or an ongoing relationship with a client, or you're a vendor, or whatever it might be, right? If we're not being genuinely ourselves, and even being able to be open and sort of willing to be vulnerable around the, we're all afraid of pushback around, let's talk about pricing, for example. We're all afraid of pushback, which makes the pricing conversation and the like actually saying the words of, here's how much it costs to work with me or my firm or the product or whatever it is terrifying, because it leaves us open to criticism, which we're terrified of. But the reality is, if we can show up genuinely, and if people do question, say, have your talking points in terms of, here's why it is $10,000 to work with you for whatever it is. It makes it that much easier to say it, which makes it that much easier for them to hear it and not necessarily kind of have their own gut response of like, oh my God, that's, inappropriate. But on top of that, from a business building standpoint, being genuine does attract more people and more potential clients. And so it works around all over the place. But I think the bottom line comes back again to that reflection conversation around, stuff does, you can have a business where you don't spend a lot of time paying attention to your language or to how you're looking at your things, from a financial standpoint. Are we paying attention to what's actually coming in and going out? Are we paying attention to how people reacted to the language that you put out in an email, for example? All of that is reflection. And if we're not taking the time to do that, our business isn't going to be as successful as it might potentially be.
Yeah, 100% agree.
So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now. So we have some version of the networking, because you've really managed to say, okay, how do I create a win-win-win, triple, quadruple win situation? But you're also doing some other new stuff too.
Yeah. So basically, I would say probably about a couple years back, I started to notice that everybody that I was working with on the relationship building stuff, anybody I was helping with that side of things, also seemed to have a messaging challenge. And what I found was that even if I could give them all of the tools to get into particular doors or get into particular conversations, if they didn't have something interesting to say when there, it didn't really work. So I started looking at this, and what I realized, and this actually goes back to what we were just talking about, basically there's been this big push over the past couple of years about being different and standing out. And as a result, you had a bunch of people start to teach people how to be different and how to stand out. Sure. So what's happened is that now everyone's different is starting to feel the same. Mm-hmm. Where it's just kind of like, okay, I've seen that before. I recognize that before. So I started to look at this and I say, okay, So if differentiation isn't the only thing that causes us to want to talk about somebody's stuff or be interested in somebody's stuff, then what is it? What is it that causes us to see somebody as a thought leader? What is it that causes us to share somebody's ideas and processes? And then I looked back at my own story and I was like, well, what got people from the Broadway world to be interested in talking to me? And then what got me to a point where like an educational technology startup brought me on? And what got people from the marketing world and the personal development world to come my way? And I realized it was the fact that I would take these ideas, I would package them in such a way that other people would talk about it and tell people my frameworks. And then all of a sudden they would just refer back to me. So I realized, oh, wait a second, a really solid brand is one that's referable. So I came up with this idea of creating a referable brand. And it started as just like a little thing that I was teaching in some of my workshops and some of the things I was doing, but more and more people kept asking me about it. So I decided to dig deeper into it. And when I broke it down, I realized that a referable brand has 3 factors, and it's easy to remember because it spells the word AIM. And that's accessibility, influence, and memory. So the first hurdle that we have is accessibility, because most of the time we end up what I like to refer to as the echo chamber of the enlightened, where everybody's using the same language, everybody's saying the same thing because we're all in the same world, but we go outside of that world, we go outside of that industry and we try to talk to people and they're like, what are you talking about? I don't understand it at all. So we always have to first start with like, how do we make sure that our ideas and what we do for people is super clear, so that we don't have to deal with, others being like, well, what does that word mean? And what does that word mean? And what does that word mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next phase that we have to deal with is influence, which is, will people actually do something for us? Are they going to share our ideas? Are they going to help us? Are they going to support us? Not just do you have followers, but do you have people who will actually do things? Right? Because we could have hundreds of thousands of people reading our stuff or following our stuff, but if we ask them to do something, do they do it? And that's a big, big piece that a lot of us forget about. We don't take the time to say, okay, out of this mass of people who I've gathered on my list, let's just say, how many of these people will actually do something?
Right.
How many of these people will buy? How many of these people will share the information, et cetera?
Right.
But then the last piece that I think is one that we just don't take a lot of time to think about, and I spend way too much time thinking about it because I'm a language nerd, is memory. And how do we make it so that we craft something that it is easy for people to remember so that they'll share it with their friends? Because you could have the best content and the best material, but if somebody else has figured out a way to package it so that it's easier to remember, they're going to share the other person's stuff, even though yours is more well-researched, more solid, because people like to look good when they share information. So if you go to a cocktail party, you want to tell the cool story. You don't want to tell the story where you're trying to figure out where it was and how it worked and all this other stuff. It's like my daughter's almost 3, and you end up watching all these Pixar movies, right? And I just think of Mel Brooks, Albert Brooks' character in Finding Nemo, where he basically tries to tell a joke and he gets so caught up in all of the logistics of the joke that it never is funny. So he's not a funny clownfish. Right. And then we get to the end, he's actually, able to tell a joke. I think we're all struggling with that when people tell us about their, a business. It's like, how do you turn it into something that's super easy? You just share with somebody else and send it their way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I want to pivot a little bit and ask you about your own business building experience. So what was the catalyst for you to start sort of down the entrepreneurship road? Or do you feel like you started that with the Broadway stuff?
I think I've always kind of done something of this nature. Even like back in high school, I remember our English department was very, very underfunded in comparison to all of the athletics.
Sure.
So I put together a battle of the bands in our school's auditorium to raise money for our school's English department. So I've always kind of been that person to be like, okay, I don't see this in the world. I'm going to do something to, put it into the world. So for me, it was a lot about sort of saying, okay, what are the things that just aren't available right now? And how do I craft that? How do I make that happen? And then, it was a lot of just stumbling around trying to figure out, well, how do I sell it, right? Like, how do I market it? And how do I have these conversations? And there was definitely a period in the early stages of all this, and I talk about this a lot when I talk to people in the early stages of a business, or early stages of like the networking piece and all this kind of stuff. There is a danger of becoming what I refer to as connection rich and cash poor, where everybody loves you and you're helping everybody and you're solving everybody else's problems, but nobody pays you and nobody understands why they should pay you. And I had a lot of instances in the early stages where people loved me. I was making lots of introductions. I was solving a lot of problems for folks. But if I tried to be like, oh, well, you can hire me to teach you how to do this, or hire me, it just wasn't working. And it wasn't until I started to spend some time I spent a lot of time doing a deep dive into copywriting and just sort of like understanding, like, how did people advertise? Like, how did people sell things in the past? And it wasn't until I started to look at that and get really granular with that I realized, oh, I have to package this entirely differently. It's not about what I can do for you. It's about what these tools will do to basically make you a better future version of yourself. Like, it's about this journey that you're going to go on, and the fact that I'm going to give you the tools to make it happen. But it took a while, and a lot of stumbling around, a lot of just sort of testing things and empty workshops and all the different, all the different elements. And I think that for a lot of entrepreneurs, there's these stories that are just not true, where it's like, I was broke and then I learned how to sell courses online and now I have $1 million. It's like, no, you learned things before all of that, and you probably had multiple instances of that not working out and reflecting on it and going back and forth before you hit that point. But the thing is, from just a basic media standpoint and from the standpoint of people paying attention, we pay attention to high contrast. So we're never going to pay attention to somebody just inching 5 steps forward. We're going to pay attention to the person who went, from 0 to 100.
God, I know. And from a ability to build a stable, repeatable business structure, and to actually put the dollars in your pocket that you want, because let's be honest, for many, many people, you'd be making more money if you stayed with the 9 to 5. There's a lot more potential in the small business ownership, entrepreneurial world. However, if we're not actually getting ourselves to a point where the money is flowing properly and the leads are flowing properly and it's all working well and you're still enjoying the work itself, then what are we doing? And again, this comes back to the reflection part, right? Like, let's make sure we're checking in and be like, okay, maybe I'm not where I want to be, because it's very hard to completely hit those goals on an annual basis or a monthly basis or whatever. But if we're not, then what do we need to shift and tweak to get us back on track? Right. I know somebody who has grown a hugely successful business over a very short period of time, multiple 8 figures in, 3 or 4 to 5 years. And she's done it by being very, very reflective and very interested in her numbers and very interested in the process around what do I need to drive this business machine? And I think many of us don't like to think in those terms, whether it's because we come from a different background or we just want to like play, like, I just want to do the things I love to do and people should pay me for it. Well, that isn't all that it takes, unfortunately. So those little incremental steps, I think, from my perspective, are actually the sign of a lot of potential, because the big ups and downs actually aren't very sustainable for most people.
Yeah. And I think that's the, that's the challenge that a lot of people end up with. I remember writing an article, I called it BFF, and it was Beware Financial Freedom. And it was, it was about the fact that I was sitting next to, I was at a coffee shop. I was working on something, and I basically overheard one of these, like, build a business presentations from somebody, and they kept using this financial freedom term. And it's like, you have to be very, very careful about anybody telling you that one thing is going to solve all of your problems, because there are so many variables in the work that we do, and there's so many variables to what's going to work for your business. And as time progresses, the things that are working now aren't always going to work. If technology changes, if the way that something's structured changes, if the tool that you're using to collect money suddenly has a glitch or has a particular issue, you're going to have a different business in another couple of years. So it's so important to look at, like, what are those variables, and what are the things that are working, what are the things that are not. And I think it was, I remember hearing this, I think it was on a copywriter like podcast or something. I remember somebody saying something along the lines of, the most dangerous number is one.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all about this aspect of, okay, if you're only using one service or one thing, and that thing goes down, you could be in a lot of trouble. And I always think about that as I'm sort of looking at the work that I'm doing and looking at the things that I'm putting together. I'm asking myself, okay, am I just banking this on one thing, or do I have alternatives? Do I have variables? Do I have other, opportunities?
I love that. From a strategic planning standpoint, it's always good to take a few steps back and just make sure, even if you're not implementing them right now, think through other revenue streams, or what happens if, okay, let's say that all your business comes from Facebook ads, and all of a sudden that either becomes too expensive, or, Facebook blows up, or whatever. Just for example, what happens, right? And it's so easy to get caught up in the highs and forget to plan for those glitches that inevitably happen if we want to continue with a long-term sustainable business. I was talking with someone just this morning about some shifts she's wanting to make in her business. And, and I think we have this idea that it's sort of the, I'm going to build this business that I love, especially in the first 3 to 5 years. We're all excited about it. And then we start to see traction, but a lot of times we get kind of bored, right? So it's hard to see how to take that initial idea and continue to expand and grow on it. A lot of times we just want to cut it off at the knees and start whatever is now exciting for us, because, we have that sort of kid in the candy shop version around it. And that can be really detrimental to our financial health. So I think, all of this rambling is just to say, reflection about where you are, where you want to go, and make sure you have some plans in your back pocket for when things change.
Yeah, and one thing about that, sort of shifting to other things, I was having a conversation one time about this, and the metaphor that I use is called the rung where you stop, where basically if you've ever had to climb a ladder to dive off of a diving board, there's usually at least one rung where you're like, this seems pretty high. Should I keep going? And for some people, they keep going. And for others, they get down and they may go to a different ladder. They may go and do something else. And it's so important to ask yourself, before you jump off and start another business, why are you stuck on that rung? And do you want to keep climbing? What's the, as opposed to just constantly going up and down and never actually diving, right? Mm-hmm. And I see this a lot, where basically if there's turmoil, or if there's a challenge, people will be like, oh, well, I just need to do something new, or I just need to start a new business, or I need to start a new project, etc. And it's like, well, maybe, but also what are you going to do with this? Because you're still going to encounter the same challenges in the next channel. They're just gonna look a little different, because maybe it's a different market or it's a different industry. Right. So I think it's so important to look at that, rather than trying to just go to the next thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's less sexy. Right. We don't get the same endorphin rush of digging in and going, what's not working here? And why am I feeling so crappy about it? Because who wants to look at that when we can just, eat ice cream over there instead, or whatever. But
totally.
the reality is, we also leave a lot of potential money on the table. right? So we don't need to throw the baby out with the financial bathwater necessarily. There may be a way to tweak and morph what you're currently doing so that you're not stuck there anymore. Or this new idea is a great one, but that doesn't mean that the original version is crap anymore, right? It's you've created something of value. I'm not sure what happens with our mental state where we want to just like, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are wired this way of, that's it, door shut, I've moved on. Right. Yeah. And it's really good from a new idea. This is where the entrepreneurial stuff, which is, a word, let's talk about language, is a word that gets way overused. Let's be honest, but that's the transition from entrepreneurship and that like fast, rapid fire, let's bring new things to market version to really sustainable small business. And I would argue that most people who call themselves entrepreneurs, particularly in the online space these days, really just want to be small business owners, but they don't know how to do that consistent, sustainable work to get their business to a point where they have consistent revenue and they have consistent money flowing to their personal pocket and all of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's a relationship building tie to all of this as well, because a lot of people look at how do I meet more people? How do I build a bigger network, et cetera? And they don't necessarily take the time to say, who have I already met? Who do I not know enough about yet? Who have I maybe dismissed because of a particular experience or because my business was somewhere when we first met that it's not? There's so much opportunity in sitting down and saying, who do we already know? And can we get to know them better? As opposed to just always being like, I need to meet more people. I need to get to know more people. It's great to expand the network. It's great to meet new people. That's a helpful thing, but it shouldn't be at the expense of basically just sort of blasting through folks. And now they're just like on your LinkedIn, or they're part of your, they're part of your Rolodex or whatever, as opposed to who are they?
Well, and nobody likes to feel like you're, part of a, burn and bake kind of situation where it's like, clearly I'm just a cog in your marketing, wheel. And that's not really what it's, nobody likes to feel that way. So back from the whole, like, if you're putting yourself in rooms, if we're going to spend our $5,000 to be in a room and we want to get business out of it, why are we dismissing all of that with, as you said before, right? Like a sales call, like, oh, let's catch up and learn more about each other. But really, I'm just going to do a hard sell. And the person leaves being like, either they're very nice and go, and then you just like, or like, yeah, I'll take a look at that. And then you kind of get off shell shocked and you tell yourself you're never going to talk to that person again. And you leave with a really bad taste in your mouth. Yeah. Or you feel pressured into something that you don't really want to do. And like, why would you set yourself up like for your own reputation that way either?
Yeah. I like to say that people love to feel useful. They hate to feel used.
Yeah.
And it's just like, if you let people know, what you're looking for and what you could use help with, they're always happy to support you. But the second you treat somebody as if they're a tool to get something that you want and they feel like a number, you've just torched that relationship. It's really, really hard to get back after you've done something like that. It's not impossible. Some people do salvage those relationships, but it's really hard to get back when somebody feels like they were just a number.
Yeah. Or potential, cash in pocket sort of situation, which again, that's what we're talking about. So I'm curious from your perspective, what have you found to be the hardest or most difficult area in your own business building?
I think it was, I think probably the thing that pops to mind the most, and it was a big, big issue for a long time, was was just like lead generation. And I think, that really tied to that whole connection rich and cash poor kind of dynamic, where it was just like, I was getting tons of intros and I was having lots of meetings, but nobody really fit into the category of a prospect. And then I started doing something which has worked really well for me, which is I write a daily email, and I basically just riff on certain ideas and certain concepts. And if I have something that I'm selling, I link to it. If I have something that I'm trying to build or work on, I link to it. And in many cases, people, they read these things and they get to know me over time. And some will, off of the like second or third email, reach out and want to do something or buy something. And others will be on there for, months, years even. And some cases they buy, in some cases they're just supportive. They're just like, they like my ideas and they share it, and they talk about it. And for me, it feels so much better than being the person who is like going and trying to reach out to people on LinkedIn, or going and try, like all these outreach tools. I just don't resonate with. I don't like the idea of them. So for me, it's a lot of my work now is I'm having conversations with folks who fit into the realm of the work that I do. And I'll tell them this is what I'm trying to do next, or this is who it's helpful for me to talk to. And I refer them business and they refer me business, and we stay in touch in regards to that, but never in a sort of tit for tat way. Like I've referred people tons of business and had instances where they haven't really met anybody who's been a fit for me. And conversely, I've had people, they refer me a lot of business, and what they're doing is not a certain, fit for a lot of the people that I'm talking to. And I just look at it as we're just helping each other. We're supporting each other in whatever way we can. So for some of those people, it's like, that's the other thing. I think like a lot of the time we think that the way to thank someone for a referral is to just like always have another referral. But if that referral is going to be crappy, why do it? I think if you want to thank someone, you can say thank you. And you can also say, what else do they need? And I've had numerous instances where maybe I haven't sent a referral somebody's way, but I've thought of a speaking opportunity that I could pass their way that I thought would be good. Or I've done an interview with them that I thought would be helpful, and I've thought of other ways to support them. So I think like that is always the thing that comes up, is this dynamic of how do you get into more of these conversations? And what I've found I just love more than anything else is this: create this material and invite people to have a conversation, as opposed to try to force people to have a conversation.
All right, I have two questions about what you just said. One, in terms of the daily email, is it all from a sort of business talking point, like the work that you're doing talking point, or are they sort of just like, my 3-year-old kept me up at night, last night, and here's what's on my mind kind of stuff?
Yeah, I combine the two. So if it's my 3-year-old kept me up at night and I'm telling that story, I think of what is the business lesson there. Right. And sort of how does that tie to the relationship building side of things, or how does that tie to the messaging side of things? So I'm always just kind of looking at the world and saying, like, what did I experience, or what story was kind of interesting? And then I'm saying, okay, what is the lesson that I think would be useful? Or what is the piece of, idea? What is the idea that I think could just kind of change the way that somebody's thinking? And I'm always looking at, if I'm writing the email, I want them to enjoy the story. I want them to enjoy the experience, but I want the reader to step away and say, oh, I never really thought about things that way. And if they've done that, and if they like that, they can reach out to me if they want to do something together, or they can do one of my workshops or programs or whatever. But it doesn't matter, as long as I feel like that's getting across. I'm good.
Yeah, I like that. All right, my second question is around the referral dynamic, because as you know, a lot of people like to do a monetary referral fee. And I'm really curious about your perspective on that from a cash exchange standpoint, given your focus on things.
Yeah. So I think you have to look at it as how do those people kind of interact in the world. So I certainly have people who they want to do a referral agreement and that's their process. So I just respect their process. I don't have that that's not my process. That's not the work that, that's not the way that I do things. But if that's their process and that's what they do, I'm happy to respect their process and go through it. I think the most important piece about it is transparency.
Mm.
So if you are going to engage in some sort of referral monetary relationship, you want to make sure that people know that that relationship exists. I think that where this goes sour is when people don't know that relationship exists and they feel like they were deceived, or they feel like they were taken, or they feel like the only reason you sold them something was because you were getting this percentage, right? So I think as long as you are transparent, if you have that type of relationship, then that is, I think that's the main thing. And I've certainly had instances where I've done affiliates. I do very few, but I've done affiliates, and what I do is I tell my list I'm doing an affiliate, and I'm just like, here's the deal: if you buy something, I will get some money. If that's a
Mhm.
problem, that's like
Don't buy it.
there are other links out there. You can
Hmm.
buy it from this person's website. Like, it doesn't,
Yeah.
and I'm not upset with you. Like, do whatever you've got, you're going to do. But I just think, like, different people have different processes, and some people are very much, everything for them has to have some sort of element of reciprocity. Like,
Mm.
everything for them has to have that dynamic of, like, if I'm doing this for you, this thing has to come my way.
Yeah.
And then there are other people who that's not a concern of theirs.
It's not a driver for them.
Exactly. And that's not where, that's not where it is. I think too, where this starts to get really crummy is when somebody else tries to sell somebody on the idea that these referral fees can help them make a living.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's exactly where I was going to go. So here's the
Yeah.
thing to remember, right? We can look at it a couple different ways, right? You can spend X dollars. Let's say you can spend $500 a day on Facebook ads and generate X number of leads. And some of them will want to get on the phone with you, and a certain number of those will want to actually work with you. And we take that Facebook ad fee as a direct marketing expense. So one way, if you're getting a lot of work through referral, it is worthwhile to consider, it's very nice if they're all for free and you're like, yay, I don't have any kind of overhead associated with generating this sale necessarily. That's lovely, right? Like, that's a great dynamic, but it isn't out of the realm of possibility to consider putting some kind of budgetary number toward that. And so what some people do, as opposed, you were talking about affiliates, which is a very particular kind of, you sell X people into a program or help them negotiate, then you get a certain percentage back. But a lot of times it can be a lot softer too. Like, hey, you introduced me to Susie, and Susie ended up becoming a long-term client or bought a program or whatever. I'm going to throw you, 10% of that fee back just as a goodwill gesture, because it was worth my while for that, because that was an easier connection, because Susie already has a good feeling about me because you recommended me,
Yeah.
right? So, from a business flow standpoint, it is worth thinking about, it factors into our pricing, obviously, because if we're paying people referrals, we still need to make sure that we're not like cutting ourselves short. But
Yeah.
it doesn't hurt to think about it. But I think what you're getting at is the fact that, there are people out there kind of talking from a business model standpoint of make your money on referral fees, and if you have a list of a gajillion people who really still love you and aren't irritated that you're selling them somebody else's shit all the time, go for it. But I don't think most people feel great about that.
Yeah, and I just think, it's one of those things where, you don't want to be that person who, like, every time somebody hears from you, they feel like they're going to get sold something. It just,
Yeah.
like, it is a relationship killer. And I have conversations with people all the time when they, start, these businesses, if you will. And I'll say, listen.
Like referral affiliate businesses, you mean?
Exactly, yeah. And I will say, here's the thing: you need to have something else, because if you depend on referral fees and you depend on somebody buying a product for an extended period of time as your main source of income, that's very shaky ground to be on, and you cut off a large portion of the introductions that will be made.
Mm.
Right? So there are a lot of people who will not introduce you if they are worried that you're going to pull this referral stuff with one of their higher end contacts.
It feels abusive or just
Yeah.
not respectful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, I double opt in all my introductions. So I always ask both parties first.
Yeah.
If they're interested in an intro. And I find out, like, what is the reason? So if somebody ever reaches out to me and says, I want to talk to this person, I'm like, that's great. Why? Help me understand what it is that you'd like to talk to them about. And if they say, oh, well, I think like my product would be great on their podcast or, whatever, I'll say, okay, that's great that you think that. Let me go to them and see if they agree. And if they agree, I'm more than happy to make the intro. If they think it's fantastic. But if they don't, I'm not just going to put you in touch with somebody so that you can push on them that they should be selling your stuff. Like, that's just not, a good thing to do.
It doesn't help your reputation either, right? So it just doesn't feel good across the board. Sure.
Yeah.
We could keep talking forever, and maybe we'll have to at some point. But already taken up enough of your time today. I do ask everybody this before the end of each episode, and I'm curious from your perspective, being the wordsmith that you are, what Zen Money means to you.
Ooh. I think it means, the way I think about it is this idea of sort of like money calm, where like when you think about meditation and when you think about being relaxed, there's this dynamic of like you're breathing well, you're everything is sort of just calm. And I think when I think about the idea of Zen Money, it's like you're just calm. You're not like what's going on with the bank account or what's going on with these, you're just like, okay, yeah, this is fine. And whatever comes will be fine, and it'll all work out. That's what comes to mind for me when you say that.
Awesome. I love that definition. You had mentioned your email, daily email. If anyone is interested in checking that out, we will make sure that we post links on how they can do that, unless you have a quick website you want to share verbally too.
Yeah, I'm just at smallpondenterprises.com, and when folks sign up on there, they basically get an invite to be on the daily, because I don't just say like, oh, sign up and now you're on a daily list. I make them, do an additional opt-in so I don't get people being like, hey, why am I on the daily list?
Why am I getting massive amounts of emails from Michael? Oh my God.
Exactly.
That pretty much fits with, I think, your entire personality and approach to
business. Right.
But we will post links to that as well as ways that people can find you on social media. Thank you so much for joining me today. I very much appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a real blast and a great conversation.